us so proud of America.
I'm Tommy Salmons. This is Year Zero. Today, I invited Sheldon Richman on to talk about the history of Israel and Palestine. With the Israel and Palestine conflict in the news, I figured it was only appropriate to have the man that wrote the book on it. So, I hope you get a lot out of this. I'm certain you will. Sheldon really knows his shit on this topic. But first, RyanBunting.com. For all of your graphic design needs, go to RyanBunting.com. Ryan Bunting is a great libertarian and anarcho-capitalist, and he's also a great graphic designer. He designed my podcast logo and Pete Quiñonez's podcast logo. So go to RyanBunting.com for all of your graphic design needs. As always, thank you, Tom Burton, for the music. And if you're looking to support the show, other than giving me 5 stars, reviewing, giving me a nice little blurb, and sharing it with everybody you think would be interested, you can go to the affiliate links for Learn Autonomy. Not only will you be helping to support the show, you'll also be learning how to be an autonomous human being. Check out the links in the show notes. I am here with Mr. Sheldon Richman of the Libertarian Institute. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing pretty good today. How are you, Tommy?
I'm doing well. I'm working. A lot of work. But that never ends out here on the road. We're always working hard out here. But, all right, well, I asked you on because over the last week there's been a lot of talk about Israel and Palestine. And I was like, well, why not get in touch with the guy who wrote the book? So I figured we'll get you on and see what we can't figure out. But before we dig into the current situation, you want to break down kind of the history of the Israeli-Palestine conflict for everybody?
Well, yeah, in a nutshell, that's a challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, to put it as succinctly as I can. You don't have to go back to ancient times. People think this is an ancient dispute. It's a religious dispute, and because everybody knows about the history, a little bit about the history of that area, the Roman conquest and the earlier different conquests, and lots of action there. It was an important crossroads for trade and for the several big empires: Egypt, Rome, Greece before that. And so there was a lot of action there. So people think it must reach back to that, but in fact, it really doesn't. It really goes back to the late 19th century, early 20th century, when a movement gets going. Best known as the founder was Theodore Herzl, but other people were talking about it before him, including British non-Jews came up with the idea that maybe Palestine, or part of Palestine, ought to be turned into a Jewish home, supposedly so that the Jews of the world who were considered in exile could return to that area. Now, by this point, 19th century, all over the world, and in many places quite content where they were. The United States, the reform movement gets going in the United States, and Jews are in America are quite happy to be in America. It was the freest place at that stage for religious freedom, and in many other respects. And so it actually wasn't a big hit with Jews for the most part. It was a small movement rejected by the most religious Jews, the Orthodox, who thought only God could be back to Palestine, Israel, and the Reform, who were much closer. They were much more on the secular end, who didn't believe that reconstituting an ancient state, even if they could trace their roots back to it, had any meaning in the modern world. That was then. This is now. So they weren't looking to return. That was kind of a new idea, actually going back and setting up a new modern homeland. The other problem.
I'm sorry, I was just going to ask, where did that idea originate from? Because I've read a little bit of Trotsky, and he talked about giving the Jews their own settlement.
Well, yeah, different people came up with it, but in the mid-19th century, actually, it was evangelical Protestant Britons who came up with the idea, and they've been motivated by they're evangelical views that you don't have the end of days right until the Messiah comes and the Jews return to Israel. Okay. But there might have also been some anti-Semitism thrown in there. Like, right. Here's a good way to get the Jews out of Britain. Let's give them a homeland in the Arab world. And so I have a feeling that was an appeal to a lot of people who were not Jewish, but who promoted this idea that maybe the Jews should return. I'd be a little nervous if someone were saying, I think you should have a homeland in Palestine, and guess what? I'll help you pack your bags. Ready? Come on, let's get going. I was a little suspicious of that. There's a wrinkle also to this idea of going back, because historians, and the most recent historian to write about this, Shlomo Sand, who's an Israeli professor, University of Tel Aviv, has pointed out that the Romans never exiled the Jews from that region, Judea, in 70 AD. Well, 70 in the Common Era. That's the famous date. But in fact, while some of the elite and troublemakers, revolutionaries or rebellious element were kicked out, by and large, they didn't kick out the indigenous population. They needed the taxpayers, they needed the farmers, and so there wasn't an exile. There was no evidence of an exile. There were no records anywhere. There's not even a book about the exile. Anyway, let's get to modern times.
Yeah.
So this movement actually gained steam over time. Theodor Herzl in 1896 or so sets up an organization, becomes international. They hold international conferences and begins to get a movement going. During World War I, the British government issues what's known as the Balfour Declaration, which was pushed, of course, by Zionists, which means Jewish advocates of the homeland in Israel. It wasn't a dirty word; it was their word. It was the Jewish word, Zionism. It's called a World Zionist Organization today. It's not like a frank anti-Semitic term of insult, right? Zionism was the name of the philosophy and the movement. They had lobbied very hard for the British government to give its approval for a Jewish homeland. It was worded in a very vague way in order to get it accepted by the government of Britain to set up a Jewish homeland in Palestine. It was vague on whether it would be all of Palestine or just in Palestine. Purposely vague. It was a political document. And part of the British reason for getting this is they wanted the U.S. to get into the war, World War I, and they thought that Jewish support in American Jewish support for getting into the war, because Britain was not having a good time in the war at that point, having a rough time. They thought this would help swing Jewish support for getting into the war. Most Jews weren't in favor of a Jewish state in Palestine. They were Reform and Orthodox, and that wasn't their cup of tea. They didn't like the idea. Anyway, much of it is now generally known by people. We get through World War I, we get through World War II, and the horrors of the Nazis, and the movement really catches on. And the new United Nations in 1947, the General Assembly adopts a partition recommendation. It's very important to stress the word recommendation. In other words, they recommended that Palestine, that area, that strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, be divided, because there were Jews and Arabs, Palestinian Arabs. They were all considered Palestinians in those days. living there. Slight majority, or majority for the Arabs, for the non-Jews, the Muslims. There were Muslims and Christians as well as secular Arab Palestinians. That area ought to be partitioned into a Jewish state and a Palestinian state or Arab state. And it was gerrymandered. It was a very odd. You can find the map on easily online. It was gerrymandered so that the Jewish area would get, number one, 55% of the land, even though they were under a majority of the population, under 50% of the population. But this gerrymandering would give them a slight majority in the Jewish designated area, with the rest of the land, 45%, going to the Palestinian Arabs. This was only a recommendation. Number one, the UN has zero power to partition territory. There's nothing in its bylaws about being allowed to partition territory. They were recommending it to the Security Council, but mainly they were recommending it to the British, because the British, under the mandate system that was set up after World War I at the Versailles Treaty, the Paris Peace Conference, basically made that a colony of the British. They didn't call it a colony, they called it a mandate. But they administered it. And so it was a recommendation, they didn't partition, to the British. Here's the way we think the land ought to be divided. That way, there won't be, we don't want war, we don't want fighting, we don't want anybody hurt. The Arabs, the Palestinians, were hardly consulted, and they didn't accept the partition. I mean, after all, they wanted independence from the other Arab countries. They've been pushing for that, and they were not going to give their blessing to a division of the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state or Palestinian state. They weren't against Jews living there. Jews lived peacefully with Arabs in Jerusalem and other parts of that land for a very, very long time. I mean, for hundreds of years, at least a millennium. So the Arabs wouldn't go for it. The Israelis, they wanted all of Palestine, and certainly the most hardcore Zionist organizations and people, leaders there, wanted the whole territory, but they were willing to take what was recommended in the partition as a foothold, as a beginning. And in fact, they would never declare what their borders were, because they figured in the future we'll grab more of the land. Meanwhile, they start to drive Arabs out of their villages in the land that was was part of it, was recommended for the Jewish state, and also, and this is a lot of this is even going on before the war, what's known as the War of Independence, got going. They're putting pressure on Arabs, they're scaring them out of the land, terrorizing them. Really, they have paramilitary, very powerful, well-armed paramilitary organizations that would end up becoming the new Israeli army once the state was declared. Anyway, by the time by the end of 1948, 750,000 Arabs, Palestinians, were driven or fled their land in fear because of what was going on. One of the most horrible cases is this village called Deir Yassin in April of 48. That's before Declaration of Independence from the Israelis occurs, and also before any Arab country begins to get involved to try to stop all this ethnic cleansing. Deir Yassin, there's a massacre, kills men, women, and children. I forget the number, but it's certainly well over 100. And this sort of thing happens other places, but in a lot of places people just fled because they heard about massacres, and so they just left. So the idea was there was a plan to scare people into leaving, because the idea was to purify the land, which means put it into Jewish hands. After all, don't forget, it's supposed to be a Jewish state, and if it's a Jewish state, you certainly can't have anything but a Jewish majority. And if you could get all the Arabs to leave, then fine, that's the thing to do. The Arab governments surrounding the area are then kind of goaded into getting involved, and that's where the war against Israel begins. But most of the fighting, because of the ethnic cleansing, those governments which were reluctant to fight, they weren't very well organized. They get into they head into the Palestinian parts of of Palestine, to try to save Palestinians from being driven from their homes. Anyway, it's a long story. One thing I need to highlight is Jordan was known as Transjordan at that time because it didn't have the West Bank at that point. It was only on the east bank of the Jordan River. They are secretly negotiating with Israel because the Jordanian king, who also did not want an independent Palestinian state. He wanted to rule the Palestinians. He was of that Hashemite family, which is a very prominent Arab family that had rivals. Not everybody liked what they wanted. They wanted to rule all the Arab people, but there were other families that thought, no, we want to rule. We want to be the rulers. So they cut a deal with the Israelis. Actually, they weren't the Israelis yet, with the Zionist movement, to divide the land. Israel basically said, good, okay, you King Abdullah can have what was going to be the Palestinian part of the partition. We don't want an independent state for the Palestinians. And so we'll respect that and you'll respect our side. Abdullah basically agreed. The one place where they didn't strike a negotiation was Jerusalem. Jerusalem under the plan was not supposed to be given to either side. It wasn't even supposed to be divided, one half for one side, one half for the other. It was supposed to be an international city. It never became an international city. Israel got the western side and Jordan got the eastern side. And that's where this recent fight kind of originates. I mean, there's a lot we could talk about, but that the neighborhood in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem, where Arabs were facing eviction, is called Sheikh Jarrah, and that's in what was once Jordanian-ruled East Jerusalem, and is now, since the 1967 war, Israeli-ruled East Jerusalem. That's what kind of sparked this later conflict, this later onslaught against Gaza, because people were protesting the pending evictions, because there were settlers wanted the homes and wanted the land in that neighborhood. And Israeli police attacked worshippers during the holy month of Ramadan at the Al-Aqsa Mosque, who were expressing their opposition to the evictions. And Hamas then said, if you don't stop all that, we're going to start launching rockets again. And so they started launching rockets. I hope that kind of covers.
Yeah, well, it does. It leads me to the question, what impact did Trump moving the embassy to Jerusalem have on all of this?
It was inflammatory, and things were said at the time, back when he did that a few years ago, because the official position had always been that the status of Jerusalem would be kind of one of the last things to be negotiated after, quote, the two-state solution was firmed up, because for a long time, I mean, a lot of people still are committed to two states. There's now rising opposition against the two-state. A lot of people are starting to believe two-state solution is dead and gone and it can never be revived. But Jerusalem was supposed to be the last step of all that. Israel always claimed it was the unified capital. After the '67 war, once they grabbed it from Jordan in the war against Jordan and the other Arab countries, they declared that their unified capital. In other words, their view was there's nothing to discuss with the Palestinians. Even if a second state is allowed, sorry, Jerusalem won't be part of it. It's part of Israel. But the American position has always been that is to be negotiated in the future. Trump threw that out, like he did with a lot of things regarding Israel and Palestine, and declared that he recognized that it was the unified capital of Israel. Israel had annexed it, I think, in 1980 or something. I forget the exact date. Had formally annexed the eastern part. In other words, land seized during war, which you're not allowed to do under international law. And so Trump moved the embassy there as more than a symbolic show of solidarity with Israel, and that was the outcome of that. It did help with a lot of discontent and protests.
Did now a lot of the conservative media, because I because I come from that side, and so many people I know are conservatives, I kind of pay attention to it a little bit more than I pay attention to any of the other media. But a lot of the conservative media are saying that, well, if Trump were still in office, this would have never happened. This latest, flare up would have never happened. And it seems to me, as you're pointing out, that it was only a matter of time, because America recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel was a big slap in the face to all of the Palestinians. And this isn't like, where a lot of people get confused is they think that if you're saying, well, Israel's doing all this wrong and they're provoking, a response, that you're defending Hamas. Now, this isn't saying that Hamas isn't a terrible organization, but we're pointing out that Israel is not, the white hats in this situation either. The real victims here, I've been pointing this out ever since it started, the real victims are the citizens. I mean, the citizens of Israel, the citizens of Palestine, they're the ones getting caught up in the middle of this power struggle between these, two opposing gangs, basically. And it's just, it's really sad for them. So was there any sign that this was happening or going to happen while Trump was still in office?
I'd have to see the exact argument by the people who make that claim that it wouldn't have happened. I don't know. I don't understand why it wouldn't have happened. I can't imagine what would Trump be doing. First of all, Biden has been as much of a booster of Israel over his career as you could possibly imagine. Proclaimed himself a Zionist some years ago. He's lately made a few statements telling Netanyahu that maybe he needs to de-escalate because he's getting some flack from some of the progressives in his party. But I really don't see that argument. Look, the thing with Hamas, you need to understand, and I don't approve of Hamas. First of all, I'm a totally secular person. I'm not religious in any respect. My background is Jewish. I have Jewish upbringing, Jewish education. But I'm, I don't regard myself as of any religion or any tribe, except good, rational people who favor freedom. That's my tribe. All good, rational people favor freedom. But when you dispossess and oppress a group of people and never engage in good faith conversations with them about how you can restore their rights, if you do that, you are going to make the most extremist, in other words, violent types rise to the top of the subjugated people. That's an old story. We know that. If you put people in a corner and take stuff away from them and don't recognize any rights, and it's especially true in Gaza, but it's also true to a lesser extent, but still a large extent on the West Bank. And it's also it's true to some extent, again, a lesser extent, but still a substantial extent, of the Arab Palestinians in Israel itself. In other words, before the pre-1967 borders, the 1948 borders, they don't have complete rights. So if you do that, you are encouraging the most violent elements to rise to the top. Because if people seem to have no other alternative, then violence is going to seem appealing. I don't approve of launching rockets, just willy-nilly toward population centers. Now, these are not great rockets. They don't have guided systems. I'm not saying they can't kill anybody, but they've killed, I think the latest count I saw is 12 people. That's tragic. But the Israeli military has killed, 67 children in Gaza. 212 or more people total, but they've killed more children than the Hamas rockets have killed Israelis. So I'm not approving of that. But I'm saying if you want to stop rockets, don't have Iron Dome, this air defense. Have real talks with people and show that you have good faith and really are sorry about what happened and you want to restore their rights and find some way to live peacefully. that'll get rid of Hamas. And, Israel encouraged Hamas in another way that's not widely known, but it was written about in the mainstream press, the wire services, and in the 1980s, I believe this is. Hamas wasn't always a player. The big Palestinian player, there were a couple of more minor organizations, was the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, which was also a coalition. Its main faction that Yasser Arafat had was Fatah. It eventually became the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accord, especially in the West Bank. The PLO was a secular organization. It was not a fundamentalist Muslim organization. It had Christians. It didn't care. It didn't talk about religion. It talked about land and politics and rights. I'm not saying I approve everything they ever said or ever did. I don't. They killed innocent people, and I don't approve of that, of course. But it was a secular organization. That's my point. Secular. Israel helped to nourish Hamas when it began to arise because it would be a divide and conquer device. In other words, if you help a religious organization rise, a more fundamentalist Sunni Muslim organization arise as a rival to the secular, you're going to hurt the influence. You're going to detract, take away influence from the secular, from the PLO, which was very representative. It was favored by most Palestinians. And so, Israel, the rulers of Israel, I don't blame the average Israeli person, really have themselves to blame for this, for the rise of Hamas, but also for the fact that the most violent element will rise to the top if you're not willing to talk to people in good faith, not phony two-state things where you're making demands they can't possibly accept, that are insulting. They wouldn't really have control over their own lives. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about real discussions in order to try to make things better, but also acknowledge that yes, we drove Palestinians off their land and we have not permitted them to return. It's funny that the dispute over houses in East Jerusalem are said that the settlers will say these were Jewish homes, except Jordan took over East Jerusalem to kick Jews out of homes, and now we want those homes back for Jews. Well, I bet you that's true in other cases. Jews probably were not well treated by Jordan in East Jerusalem after the 48 war. But some of the Arabs who moved into those homes when Jordan was in control were driven out of their West Jerusalem homes by the Israelis. And it's not just West Jerusalem. Arabs were driven out of their homes, Palestinians out of their homes through 47 and 48, and even earlier times were kicked off their land that they had farmed and worked and lived on and farmed for generations. They're not allowed to return. So why Jews have a right to return in East Jerusalem, but Palestinian Arabs don't have any right to return anywhere in the state of Israel, even if they were born there, even if their families had lived there for generations. That's why one of the reasons people are more and more declaring that Israel is an apartheid state. And two key human rights organizations, B'Tselem, which is the most prominent and respected Israeli human rights organization, that's B'Tselem, and Human Rights Watch have both recently put out reports and statements saying Israel is an apartheid state based on the principle of Jewish domination or Jewish supremacy. They've used those terms. The gloves are coming off by the critics, that they're realizing this is not something we can just tiptoe around. We have to face these issues. It's an apartheid system from the river to the sea, not just even in just the West Bank and Gaza, but that whole area. So.
Yeah, and when you look at just look at Gaza, it's an open air prison, the way that they treat these people. I mean, I've watched documentaries where you see the IDF running through the streets at 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon, telling people they're out past curfew, and you're like, what is happening here? And it's really sad to see that. And a lot of the conservatives will say, well, Israel agreed to a two-state solution, but the Arabs would never agree to it. They were always saying, no, we're going to run Israel out of the region. So you want to touch on that for a second?
In the late '80s, the PLO Arafat did finally embrace the two states idea, which meant that he was now conceding 78%. Right? Israel, under the partition idea proposal, was to be 55%. By the time the 48 war was over, they had 78%. So that's leaving Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. For the first few decades, the PLO's position was one democratic state where all rights are recognized. Now, you could say you don't believe them, but that's what the language was. It wasn't, in other words, they didn't want a Zionist regime, as they might call it, because the Zionist regime was a Jewish supremacist regime. They wanted a single state where all rights are recognized. You can look up, and again, you can doubt him, but at least let's look at the words. You can find Arafat's speech to the UN in, 1974, the famous, like, I have a gun in one hand and an olive branch in the other, and famous speech. You can see what he says, or you can look it up and read the text. In the 80s, I think he realized that wasn't going to get anywhere. By the end of the 80s, he and the PLO are saying, okay, look, you can have the 78%. Give us the 22%. Nobody ever talks about that being a big concession on the part of the Palestinians. All we hear about Israeli concessions like all the time, but they're always meaningless for the most part, because even any Palestinian state it said it was willing to have would be totally controlled in the exterior by Israel. All security would be in Israel's hands. There wouldn't be, it wouldn't be a state in the modern sense of the word state. It would be, and then since then, the way they divided up the West Bank, even a two-state solution today would include not a unified Palestinian state at all, but on the West Bank it would be little pockets of villages here, village there, and then you still have all these Jewish settlements that have been built since '67, and a wall that snakes through the West Bank and separates homes from farmland, or surrounds one village. This thing about, you mentioned soldiers walking the streets and ordering people back in their homes. That's the West Bank. They don't walk the streets normally in Gaza. It's true that in the early 2000s, the Israelis withdrew from Gaza. You often hear this by the pro-Israel side in the United States saying, what do you want? They withdrew from Gaza, and look what Gaza did. But they turned to Hamas and they fire rockets. Well, yeah, they withdrew and they took out settlements because they had built Jewish settlements in Gaza. It's true, they withdrew the army and they took the settlements out, so the Jews left. But that didn't mean Gaza was left free. It's like if you take the prison guards out of a prison, but they're still in control. They control the perimeter and they control who and what gets in and out. Sure, you can call that a withdrawal, but did they set them free? Did they liberate? No. Withdrawal doesn't equal liberation. And so, like you say, it's an open-air prison. And since, 2011, 2012, there's been a siege, almost a total blockade of it controls Gaza. Israel controls by air, land, and sea what can get in, what goods can get in. And lots of things can't get in. They've had trouble getting some medicines and food. Water is barely fit for consumption. More than half the population is under 18, so a lot of children are in pretty bad shape as well. So it's a bad scene. And then every couple of years, Israel then has this unbelievable military power that it unleashes on Gaza. Yeah, you might say, Gaza, they launched some rockets and they endanger Israelis and maybe even kill a small number of Israelis. But the idea that to talk about Hamas's power and Israel's power, to use those same terms, power, is a joke, because Hamas is like a mouse compared to a dinosaur. The Israeli, the Israeli have the premier military in the region. They get almost $4 billion worth of military equipment and money from the United States every single year, and there's a bill of $700 billion being talked about in Congress at this moment while we speak. It's a joke to say, well, these two powers, or that Israel has a right to self-defense. What about why don't the Palestinians have a right to self-defense? It's absurd to be talking in those terms.
Yeah, it almost makes you feel like no matter what happens, what the Palestinians do from the side of Gaza, they could go almost as far as they want, and you could find reasoning that it is self-defense because just the boot that's been on their neck for so long, and it's really distressful. But I know you wanted to keep this a little short. You had things to do, and I got stuff to do too. So plug whatever you got to plug, and we'll get off here.
Well, go to the Libertarian Institute. You'll read up articles on this pretty much each day. There's been something posted either from some other site or something original. I have a book that came out, was it last year or the year before now? Through the Libertarian Institute, you can find it, or at Amazon, called Coming to Palestine, which I think is a pretty good layman's discussion of all of this that I talked about today from a libertarian standpoint. I really stress, because people are used to thinking, because this is what they hear, that criticism of Israel is coming from sort of the left, in the traditional sense of left, right? Socialists, progressives, people that the libertarians don't have much in common with, so they are skeptical that they're getting the truth. When you think about it, this is a property rights dispute. This is an argument over land. Who owns it? I don't mean it, and I don't mean it in the terms of what people own it or what nation owns it. Which individuals own individual pieces of land? Palestinian individuals were driven off their land. That's a Lockean property rights argument and analysis. And there's no way to describe it without it. Even when when you hear the left talk about it, very often you think, what are they now? Are they pro-property rights? Great, that's good to know. Of course, they don't really see it that way. So I would recommend, if you want to know what's going on, and it's relevant today, today's conflict, if you want to know the history, but it's not going to flood you with data, and it's not over technical, it's written for people who know very little, I would recommend my book. I mean, of course, it's my book. It's self-serving, but take a look at it and read the Libertarian Institute each day. You'll find stuff not just on this issue, but all political issues.
He also has another book, What Social Animals Owe to Each Other, which is very good. I recommend both of Sheldon's books, especially the one Coming to Palestine. And I'll make sure I put both of those in the show notes so that people can find it easily. And I'll send them to the Libertarian Institute because fuck Amazon. So,
okay.
I appreciate you, Sheldon. I'll be glad to have you on again anytime.
Anytime, Tommy. I enjoyed it.
All right, buddy. You have a good one.
You too.
So much of the focus of my podcast is to point out abuses of power and how bad things have gotten and the direction in which we're heading as a society, and it can be a real black pill. I've partnered up with Richard Grove to offer my listeners an opportunity to sign up to his Autonomy Course. The Autonomy Course is designed for people looking for solutions, people that want to shape their own future, people that are not willing to be at the behest of large corporations or the United States government or the banking system. The Autonomy Course is designed for those of you who wish to have complete control of the reins of your life, who are looking to be successful, to thrive and not just survive, to provide for your family by utilizing your existing skills and learning how to market and sell those skills in order to be your own boss, or learn new skills in order to leverage that into a new career opportunity. So if there's a job out there you've been trying to get or you've been wishing you could get, but you just don't have the skills for it, the Autonomy Course is the place for you to start, to learn how to land that position, to learn how to market yourself better, to gain confidence, and to be surrounded by a community of like-minded people that will encourage you and help you along the way. So use my affiliate links and go check out the Autonomy Course. It could be right for you.
Play this game of pick and choose. Well, it's a game that was made for you to lose. It doesn't really matter how many times, it's the same old worn out stories, same old lines. They're all pointing dirty fingers in hypocrisy, bragging on their feats of mediocrity again. Never really making any kind of change, but they keep on getting re-elected, and I find that strange. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants out of taking our freedoms. Yeah, I said fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants out of taking our freedoms. What's it gonna take for you to see that we're living in a rigged democracy? People stand in line for the thieves that they've been choosing, paying no attention to the rights they keep on losing. But they all gather in the rallies and they chant their names, on goddamn well that it's all gonna be the same. Just 4 more years of war and taxes, 4 more years of them grinding down their axes. And that's why I say fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms. Yeah, fuck them, don't feed them, cause we don't even need them. I never celebrate the tyrants that are taking our freedoms.